and welcome to Government 340. Today we are going to be discussing the economics of the post-Soviet transition period. So far we've been talking about kind of the nature of rule in post-Soviet Central Asia, so looking at regime type, the types of conflicts that have developed, and how this fits in with the historical context of the region. But today we're going to be switching gears a little bit and talking specifically about the economics. So how has the transition away from socialism impacted Central Asia? So with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there came several different types of economic reforms that were primarily focused on privatization, so taking the government-owned businesses, and in the Soviet Union, the government owned everything from large businesses to small, everyday mom and pop shops, not mom and pop if they're owned by the government, and there was a process of privatizing these and also instituting a series of market reforms. So this actually started a little bit prior to the collapse of the USSR with Gorbachev's perestroika and the glasnost political and economic reforms. So there was a little bit of opening and kind of a slower institution of a lot of these reforms, or the attempts to do so, prior to the Soviet collapse. And a good portion of this was the economic restructuring of the Soviet Union, in large part to battle the economic recession that was already occurring in the state, to kind of institute some of these elements of market reforms. You saw China pursuing very similar programs, so they kind of instituted a policy of glasnost, so an economic restructuring without the corresponding political opening. So glasnost without perestroika, and the government in China was able to weather kind of the instability caused by widespread economic reforms because they did not institute the corresponding political ones, whereas this led to a great deal of instability in the USSR under Gorbachev in the later years of his time in power. So once again, privatization was this process of trying to fairly distribute a massive amount of state-owned property to the citizenry. And this was primarily done through a voucher system. So people were able to buy or invest in shares of a company with these vouchers. The problem primarily seen across post-Soviet space is that due to the economic downturn, people were interested in selling these vouchers, and people who were economically better off at the time of the collapse were able to buy these vouchers at very low prices, and this allowed certain individuals to gain majority control of a lot of the state-owned companies. And this is where you see the creation of the oligarch class in post-Soviet space. So you have a very powerful group of business owners. You see them influencing policies in Russia, you see them in Ukraine, you see them across Central Asia, where wealth is very highly concentrated. And this stems from the lack of transparency with regards to the voucher program, and the lack of knowledge that individuals had on how to negotiate this kind of voucher system and what it meant to invest or have shares in a company, and the long-term impacts of having shares in a company. And keep in mind that the Soviet era had lasted for 70 years. So it had been 70 years before this, since this type of investment had been ongoing in the Soviet Union. So there was a lack of knowledge on how to navigate this new system that led to a lot of people being taken advantage of. The economic downturn in the 1990s also meant that people weren't primarily concerned with long-term planning. So it wasn't at the forefront of people's minds to invest in their futures. They were more concerned with getting food on the table for their families now. Some regions of the former Soviet Union were more open or transparent than others. In the Czech Republic, for instance, they had a very open process of these voucher sales. Then they engaged in multiple rounds of voucher sales in order to prevent vouchers from being valued at either more or less than their actual market value. So the ability to adjust the prices of those vouchers for market prices was something that was instituted in the Czech Republic. But you don't see that taking place everywhere. And you also see the state being able to monitor these types of sales better when they have greater institutional strength. So when the state is more effective, they were able to sell off these vouchers more to their interests than in others. So in the Czech Republic, their goal was to have an equitable distribution of wealth. In the Soviet In Russia, however, the creation of this oligarchic class actually worked in the interest of the ruling elite in that they had connections to those oligarchs and were able to kind of solidify the power of the presidency in Russia on the basis of having control of the economics of the country. In addition to privatization, there were a series of other market reforms, primarily being pushed by the West and Western institutions such as the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the IMF, so the International Monetary Fund. And these organizations had a tremendous amount of say in what sort of reforms should be instituted in Central Asia and across the Soviet Union, because they controlled the acquisition of loans by these state governments. And these institutions were primarily interested in the institution of market reforms because there was an assumed linkage between democracy, capitalism, and economic success. So by instituting democratic reforms, by instituting these economic reforms to push these countries closer to capitalism, they would see greater economic success, was the assumption, and that an end result of that would be greater democratization. However, in much of Central Asia, these countries were primarily agricultural and rural economies, and this caused a lot of problems for Western-oriented market reforms, in that these sectors did not attract a lot of foreign investment. So you might see foreign investment in banking and finance, particularly in oil sectors, in some aspects of mining or extraction industries, or even in like manufacturing sectors or textiles. But you don't see it primarily in agriculture. And because of this, the reforms that were the main focus of the Western community were not the ones that needed to occur in a lot of Central Asia and undercut their primary means of income, being those agricultural sectors of the economy, and that those sectors contracted when they instituted market reforms. And this has caused a lot of scholars and writers and individuals in post-Soviet space to look back at this time of reform and of the pressure placed on this region by Western institutions very critically. So they have a negative view of these institutions. And we saw this come to the fore particularly in Satyebaldeva's piece, where she is very, very critical of the impact of Western financial institutions on Central Asia. And Satyabaldeva is particularly critical of the fact that Western companies were trying to make money from money. So they were making money off of investment, off of the interest payments being made on these loans, not necessarily on the productivity of different sectors in Central Asia. So rather than providing goods or services or even investment in useful sectors, the investments that they saw from Western organizations really only served to drive a lot of Central Asian states into debt. And Western institutions have been making money off of the fact that these countries are highly debt-ridden. Additionally, none of the Western reforms really provided any help towards their ability or even incentives to prevent corruption or instituting these reforms. So there's no forcing mechanism. A lot of these states would make very surface level reforms, but not actually institute them Due to the lack of an institutional underpinning and the relative state weakness and beholdenness to local and national elites, you see these reforms being used to enrich individuals in the state. So even if they are bad for the whole of society, and we do see declining agricultural and manufacturing sectors in Central Asia, you see the political elites still managing to enrich themselves. So the main beneficiaries of these privatization and market reforms have been a small elite class, and according to Zati Baldeva, Western institutions. And this has come at the cost of the majority of the citizenry of the various Central Asian states. And once again, there's very little incentives to reform this among the political elite, because they are very much enriching themselves on these policies. Additionally, we still see legacies of the Soviet period, so there has been some continuity despite the breakup of the Soviet Union and the dissolution of that government, being that the borders of the Soviet Union have persisted. And within the Soviet Union, the different republics had different specializations. So you saw Kazakhstan being a source of oil wealth and a site of the Russian military-industrial complex. You saw Kyrgyzstan being a source of rare metals and also part of that military-industrial complex. You see Uzbekistan being kind of this source of cotton and textile wealth to the Soviet Union. So you see the different republics specializing in the provision of different products. And after independence, this means that they often had overdeveloped sectors at the cost of others. So we talked about this earlier with Uzbekistan, was that they were slow to institute reforms because they were after this idea of economic autarky. So they wanted to be able to provide for their own economic well-being and their population without having to import goods from other countries. And part of that was to overcome this kind of hyper-specialization that you see during the Soviet period. And last, we see the lasting impact of the Soviet subsidies, in that a lot of products were subsidized by the Soviet government during the time of the USSR. And when it collapsed, so did these government subsidies, and this initially worsened the economic downturn that you saw with the decline of the Soviet Union, and in doing so made this region initially much worse off than potentially other regions of the Soviet Union. And you see a lot of individuals in Central Asia miss the government subsidies from the Soviet Union, and that this creates a degree of nostalgia because products were cheaper and easier to come by in the Soviet Union when trade barriers between the various Central Asian republics, and then also with Russia and with the other republics in the USSR, were virtually non-existent. And you see the reconstitution of these trade barriers really harming the economies within the area of Central Asia. We also see differences across Central Asia. So sometimes it's easy to consider this region to be monolithic, but their approach to reforms in the post-Soviet era has been different. So we see some Central Asian states being much more open to reform in the immediate post-Soviet period. So Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan were viewed as the best reformers in the initial post-collapse period, whereas Uzbekistan was viewed as the worst. We also see privatization taking place at very different paces across the Central Asian states. So privatization took a year in the Czech Republic, but it took 5 years in Kyrgyzstan, for instance, and they started much later. And then it's still technically ongoing in Uzbekistan, where they were able to sell off a lot of smaller, medium-sized businesses, but the state has maintained control over larger businesses. And Uzbekistan didn't use the voucher system that you see across the rest of post-Soviet space. Instead, they were trying to maintain state control over these businesses, but that really depressed enthusiasm. So they've had a lot of trouble buying. So they had a lot of trouble selling the shares in these larger businesses, forcing them later on to attempt to sell them off to international buyers. But they've been engaged in some shady business practices in order to maintain control over these businesses that are being used to enrich state officials. We also see an impact on the basis of access to resources. So Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan have access to oil and gas. And Kazakhstan has been able to use these resources to forge connections with the global economy, whereas Turkmenistan has had more difficulties in doing so. But the presence of resources and the investments generated from extraction has meant that these two countries have been able to negotiate the requirements for their aid from the West or the loans that they receive, more so than you might see in Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan, where Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan have to institute whatever reforms are mandated by the World Bank, whereas Kazakhstan can afford to either negotiate or outright refuse demands and might still receive loans. Or even it's the necessity of it having loans to maintain government solvency is less than you might see in other regions of Central Asia. We also see differing levels of international involvement. So Kazakhstan has been the main beneficiary by and far over the other Central Asian republics. And it's the most popular site for international investment. From the US, from Russia, from China, all of these states have invested far more in Kazakhstan than they have in other regions of Central Asia. For example, in their Belt and Road Initiative, China has invested more in building up infrastructure in Kazakhstan than they have in the other 4 Central Asian states combined. Theoretically, Kyrgyzstan could have received more international investment and more international interest, if not for 2 factors. The first being that they don't have any oil or gas, so there wasn't a large initial interest in investment in the same way that there was for Kazakhstan. And there's also been a high degree of instability in Kyrgyzstan. So mentioned this before in previous lectures, Kazakhstan has received more international interest because of its oil and gas resources and also because of its relative stability within the region. And international investment across Central Asia or even across post-Soviet space has been risky for a lot of international actors due to the weak or non-existent rule of law. So there's always the potential when you have high wealth concentration and a tendency for political elites to use the lack of government institutions as a avenue to enrich themselves, that when you have international actors come in and try to invest, that those investments will not be fruitful because they will be seized by government actors once they become economically viable. Uzbekistan has been viewed as a particularly risky site for foreign investment because Uzbek officials have set a precedent for seizing back assets that have been purchased by foreign individuals or companies. So they will try to sell off struggling assets to foreign actors, and then once those foreign actors have invested a good deal of money and kind of turned around these companies, you will see the government use loopholes in their legal codes to then seize them back from the groups that had bought them. You saw this in McGlinchey's piece where he was talking about the Kazakh investment group that had bought a cement plant in Uzbekistan, where they're now engaged in international litigation against Uzbekistan in order to regain control after the government seized those assets. And while the international courts are hearing the cases, there isn't any real enforcement mechanism on the international stage for these courts. So it could be that Uzbekistan refuses to listen to whatever decision these courts reach. And it seems unlikely without extensive economic reforms that the government would stop doing policies like this. Additionally, these policies tend to hurt the population of the country the most, while protecting political elites. Additionally, with the institution of kind of these market reforms and privatization, you see the collapse of the Soviet welfare state. So one of the foundational slogans of the Bolshevik Party was peace, land, and bread. It was the idea that the Bolshevik Party would bring peace, so there would be a lack of conflict between peoples, that people would have access to land because that was particularly difficult to come by, and it was concentrated in the hands of very few. And remember that the Russian Federation or the Russian Empire got rid of serfdom relatively late. So a lot of people still did not have access or ownership of land, and that people would have bread so that they would have food. And the Soviet redistribution programs very much focused on the provision of these goods. So this included schooling, though there were some differences based off of location and gender and language. So women were still less likely to receive full schooling. Russian language programs and people who were fluent in Russian had more avenues for political and economic advancement. You saw programs for education better in some areas of the Soviet Union vis-a-vis others. But the program's main goal was to institute a policy of literacy across the Soviet Union. And in this, they were largely successful. They had very high literacy rates across the Soviet Union, and you saw literacy rates in Central Asia jump really dramatically during the Soviet era. So this policy had a lot of success, even if the Soviet Union was less efficient at providing other sorts of goods or policies or governance. You also see the Soviet Union guaranteeing employment, and this is a particular cause of nostalgia in the post-Soviet era, that during the time of the Soviet Union, people knew that they would be employed, and that was a government policy for the 70 years that the Soviet Union was a political entity. And you see massive unemployment and underemployment in Central Asia in modern times, when this is like partially why they have such large migrant working communities, so that people are forced to leave their homes in the Central Asian republics to go work in Russia or in China, to provide for their families. So a tremendous portion of modern Central Asian republics generate their wealth through wage remittances. And these perceptions have persisted of the role of government. So the government's job during the Soviet era was to alleviate poverty. And during the Soviet Union, this came through the provision of government subsidies. So not only was this on oil and gas, but it was also on basic food products, on electricity, on water. The basic idea being that it was the government's responsibility to provide access to these basic necessities and provide a baseline of goods and services to the population. And the collection capabilities of the government and then the redistribution of wealth was a cornerstone of government legitimacy. And this is a front from which the neoliberal economic policies that were instituted on the recommendation of Western economic institutions, have faced a large amount of criticism. Now, the ideas behind neoliberal economic reforms is that it is meant to stimulate the entrepreneurial activity in a state and development of the private sector. The problem is that this is not great during either economic collapse or in primarily agricultural or rural economies. So it's assuming that a country is in the process of industrializing, or it is an industrial power oftentimes. And in the case of Central Asia, even if these countries did have industrial bases, they were not predominantly urban economies. They were still predominantly rural ones. And this has impacted a lot of Central Asian states. So initially, Uzbekistan actually benefited from the fact that they didn't institute these neoliberal economic reforms. The fact that they refused interaction with the international community and kind of isolated themselves from even their regional economic community benefited Uzbekistan in that they didn't institute these reforms and were able to maintain some elements of their welfare apparatus and also maintain their manufacturing sector. So you actually saw contraction in a lot of these states' economies after instituting these neoliberal economic reforms, but they also acquired a tremendous amount of debt through the loans associated with those reforms. So their economies contracted, and thereby reduced their ability to pay off of these new loans that they had gained while their economies collapsed due to these new policies. Now, this didn't offset elite corruption in Uzbekistan, and the massive amount of elite theft and bureaucratic decay over time has harmed Uzbekistan. But in that initial stage, you saw the economic collapse of the USSR not affect Uzbekistan to the same degree as in the other 4 Central Asian republics. Additionally, neoliberal policies discourage redistribution and place a lower burden on the state to alleviate poverty. So this is now the job of the population to get themselves out of poverty through their own creativity. However, this meant that the state, a state already engaged in massive amounts of theft of its own assets to enrich those in power, was no longer necessarily beholden, or not as beholden to the population that it is meant to provide for. So the government now has less of a burden to the population that it has been systematically stripping of all of its assets. And this furthers a lot of the opportunities for government corruption. However, this may not have been the case. Neoliberal economic policies are not necessarily a bad thing in all cases. They were particularly bad in Central Asia because a lot of these states use those reforms as an opportunity to capture state resources and assets. So the elites in these countries were using the lack of oversight and the lack of institutional power of the states in Central Asia to use these new reforms as an avenue for self-enrichment. That doesn't mean that this always happens with neoliberal economic policies, but it does tell us that neoliberal economic policies should probably not be implemented in states with weak government oversight. Additionally, foreign loans have reinforced the power of the ruling elite. So rather than going to funding the population, they've instead gone to this already enriched ruling class. So we see an increasingly better off political elite at the cost of the population. So this happened first with that voucher system during privatization, and subsequent reforms have served to further enrich that group at the cost of this more rural agricultural population located in Central Asia. And as a result, we've seen a widening of the urban-rural divide. So there's a lack of investment in economic opportunities in rural areas of Central Asia. And we've also seen the depopulation of rural zones in Central Asia. And as a result of this post-Soviet era and the impact of this clientelism between like the ruling elite and the provision of political and economic opportunities on the basis of having these political connections to the members of the elite that have enriched themselves, poverty levels and social inequalities in much of Central Asia have increased in the post-Soviet era, despite their institutionalization or attempted institutionalization of these reforms. On the subject of labor, we've seen a large degree of continuity from the Soviet era into modern politics. So the Soviets had attempted to institute modernization reforms both through education and training, although this wasn't uniform across the entirety of the USSR, and Russification, so the knowledge of Russian language and Russian culture, was key to upward mobility even in the various non-Russian republics of the USSR. But again, literacy and full employment were the cornerstones of Soviet rule and its policies towards labor. Both in modern politics and during the Soviet period, we have seen women not have full employment in Central Asia, and a lot of this stems from kind of this policy towards double employment. So they tended to receive fewer years of education in comparison to men, and the Soviet Union authorities typically turned a blind eye to this policy. And so we don't have good records of their exact dropout rates of Soviet schooling, but this did definitely have an impact where they were taken out of school and placed back in the home and the domestic economy. And many women complain about the fact that they're still expected to care for the home in its entirety. So even if they do work a full-time job, they're still expected to fully take care of the home. And this puts a lot of pressure on women entering the workforce and really depresses the participation of women in the workforce, since they have incentives to not do so if they also already have a job that doesn't pay, but they are expected to do culturally. Still, you have seen an increasingly large number of women in the workforce, or even in taking leadership roles in local communities, and this is primarily due to the predominance of migrant work. So you have a lot of men from these rural areas leaving, and this has opened up avenues for advancement in the local economy for women. Due to the authoritarian regimes and the general political instability in Central Asia, it has been impressive that the leaders in this region have managed to maintain secure borders. So there haven't been really any changes to the borders between Central Asian states, and even when there are conflicts, even if they are ethnic conflicts, we've seen very little spillover of violence from one republic to another. However, the security of these borders and their increasing militarization has placed limits on free trade and the movement of people. While there are less chances for conflicts or conflict spillover effects, we also have not seen as much economic growth as we would have if there was the free movement of people over these borders. So there's been a lack of steady growth and development within the region, and relations with the US and Europe have been hampered by the lack of reforms and instability, and the fact that authoritarian rule has continued. And increasingly, these countries are more and more reliant on the Russian Federation and China due to the fact that they institute fewer conditions onto loans that they receive. And the lack of reforms means that the population is still predominantly rural. And the migrant community has proved very important for their continued viability. So in these rural communities, the fact that younger people leave and send money back, or even if they're older individuals, a lot of families are reliant on the fact that they have members living abroad and sending money back. And this constitutes a large percentage of these countries' GDP. So 50% of the GDP in Tajikistan, 30% in Kyrgyzstan, and 25% in Uzbekistan stem not from economic productivity that takes place within those countries or employment that they receive there, but comes from these countries receiving income from a large migrant community that lives abroad and is sending money back. And this also harms economic development. So a lot of their working population is outside of the country, and it's also risky. We see risks of human trafficking and worker abuses, and these workers tend to have very little recourse for any sort of abuses that they might face in a foreign country. And we can see this now with COVID-19 breaking out, is that we have members of the migrant workers attempting to get back to their homes, and they cannot, so they're stuck on the border essentially, and they've lost their jobs in whatever country they were working in, but they also cannot return home. And even if they did, they're not likely to find work there either. So anytime there's any sort of crisis like we're seeing now, these populations are particularly vulnerable. So switching gears a little bit from these market reforms and the impacts of the post-Soviet era on the welfare state and labor, we're instead going to focus on the impact of the presence of natural resources in Central Asia. And one concept that's really important to first discuss is that of Dutch disease. So Dutch disease is a term that was coined in the 1970s to describe the decline in the manufacturing sector after a large natural gas field was discovered in 1959 in the Netherlands. So after they found oil and gas, we saw the economic output of the country increase on the basis of this extraction industry, but we saw their industrial and manufacturing output actually decrease as a result of finding the this oil field. So Dutch disease states that the presence of of natural resources leads to economies that are geared towards extraction of said resources at the expense of all others. So there's this hyper focus on a particular segment of the economy, one that's based primarily on extraction, and unfortunately, compared to other sectors of the economy, so compared to factory work or even textiles or agriculture, extraction-based companies employ relatively few people. So less people are employed, and there are less economic opportunities in other sectors of the economy. Additionally, there's an influx of foreign currency, and this causes an increase in the real exchange rate. So their money is valued at a higher amount than it was prior to any sort of resource boom. And this lowers the price of imports, but it doesn't lower the price of domestic goods. So the price of domestic goods remains the same, but you are able to better purchase goods that are from outside of your country. So this causes an additional contraction on the manufacturing sector because you see people buying fewer domestic products than you otherwise would. So this can actually cause something called deindustrialization and the collapse and degradation of manufacturing and agricultural sectors in a country in the long term. And an additional problem that stems from this has very long-term impacts on a country's economic development because oil goes through booms and busts. So while it is something that can bring a large influx of foreign capital, it is also something that eventually declines. And especially when oil and gas prices are highly unstable, this can contribute to government instability and particularly large and devastating economic crashes. And due to the lack of economic diversification, the economies in these countries are particularly beholden to fluctuations in the global market. You also see a correlation between Dutch disease and authoritarian rule. So a lot of these countries, due to the fact that oil and gas resources are often nationalized, the profits from these extraction economies are felt by the state's elite. And then the state elites can use these profits to provide either private goods to their supporters or even public goods to the state writ large, but there's a less of an impetus on the state's need to tax its citizenry. And on the front, it would be really nice if you didn't have to pay taxes, because it feels like the government is taking your money, and the government is taking your money. If you have to pay taxes, that means that the government is reliant on its population for its continued existence. So taxes necessitate that the government has to listen to the people a little bit more than it would if it didn't need taxes. So there's no impetus to force the government to listen to its population if it doesn't need to tax said population. So the individual people or even groups of people or regions of the country don't have quite as much of a say in an economy that is based off of these extraction economies because the government has enough money to fund itself without having to listen to its population. So this can really serve to solidify authoritarian rule because there's no real need for the government to institute reforms or potentially engage in some sort of economic political opening to provide more for its citizenry because it's unnecessary. When looking at Central Asia, it's easy to focus on oil and gas as natural resources, but water and electricity are also very much natural resources in Central Asia. And there's two competing roles of water in Central Asia. So the first is power. So a lot of countries have invested a lot of money in the construction of hydroelectric dams. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan in particular have invested in these dams. And you see this because they are the site where a lot of the rivers in Central Asia start. And the competing goal is that they're used for farming and irrigation purposes. So you see this in Uzbekistan and also in Kazakhstan, where they're used to irrigate crops or to water livestock. And there are competing interests between Central Asian states. So despite the militarization of their borders or the relative difficulties in crossing borders in Central Asia, these countries are interlinked by these rivers. So there's a relative water scarcity in Central Asia, but there are rivers. And those rivers do provide the majority of the water that these countries have. So there's less of their water is provided via either rainfall or underground aquifers. They're predominantly reliant on these rivers, which means that any policies that are instituted by Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan with regards to their hydroelectric dams also affect the downriver countries. So when Kyrgyzstan, for instance, tries to increase the output of its hydroelectric dams, you can see this causing irrigation shortages in Kazakhstan or even triggering floods in downriver areas. And so there's a great potential for environmental damage to all of the downstream areas for whatever decisions are made by countries that are upstream. So if there's any sort of mining accident or spill in Kyrgyzstan, for instance, that can affect everything that is located downstream. Similarly, if something happens in Tajikistan where water is further restricted, that can impact farming in Uzbekistan. We also see a lot of problems with regards to investment and potential environmental disasters. So we see a rising population in the region, and also global warming threatens these water supplies. So a lot of the rivers in Central Asia start at glaciers, but those glaciers have been melting due to global warming. So there's less water volume. That's trying to sustain a larger population. A lot of the dams and irrigation networks, additionally, in Central Asia have not received much investment in the post-Soviet era. So keep in mind that these are not sectors that the international community has been particularly interested in investment because they don't turn quite as big of a profit as the extraction of oil and gas, for instance. And as a result, we've seen these infrastructure projects degrade over time, and this increases the potential for both ecological disasters and for harm to the population. And additionally, it's still very common, even in Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan. So they aim to be exporters of electricity to the surrounding countries. And despite this, you still see blackouts being incredibly common across these countries. And this triggers a lot of frustration, and related back to those perceptions of government fairness, the lack of investment and the rampant government corruption means that these institutions are not functioning as they should. And we continue to see an unfair distribution of resources. And for a more nefarious purpose, the government can use access to water and electricity to target specific populations. And it attempt to starve them out, essentially. So to force populations off of their land if they have access to resources or to key areas of the country. The government can very much use its control of these resources to drive people away and then continue to seize these assets. So this lecture has been primarily negative about the prospects and situation in Central Asia with regards to the post-Soviet economic reforms. But it's not entirely without hope. And so there are a lack of state-led institutions in Central Asia. And this can lead a lot of people to assume that there is a Hobbesian system of state predation. Hobbes wrote that without a state leviathan, so without competent state institutions, life will be nasty, brutish, and short. And it is a regional theme that Central Asia is full of rampant elite corruption, elite theft, and a lack of a rule of law. And this allows individuals to enrich themselves at the cost of the population. And power in Central Asia translates to the ability to abuse the rule of law for their own interests. And the social contract that you see between the state and its population has largely collapsed. And the lack of certainty about the future means that there's little investment and a lack of interest in long-term projects, which triggers additional self-enrichment on the part of elites. But this does not mean that individuals have no means of protection. A lot of the literature has focused on kind of these protection rackets or kind of traditional criminal protection elements where people can pay to have their assets protected from the state. However, we have seen numerous instances in Central Asia of individuals able to operate collectively to organize, to promote, and protect their own interests. Rather than relying on the state for a lot of products, goods, or services, they instead turn towards local means of social organizing. So one of the instances discussed in our readings for class today was one in which these local Kyrgyz villagers had organized against a Canadian-owned mining company that had spilled cyanide into their water supply. So they were able to form these local organizations and found a nonprofit and essentially organize in order to gain benefits and additional protections from the state. So they were able to organize and lobby the state in order to be assured basic protections. And this not only happened in the original location of the spill, but across Kyrgyzstan, outside of other mining sites in the country. And despite state predation on individuals, this can be used in order to mitigate the impact and influence of the state. And especially on the local level in Central Asia, we see these dense societal ties serve as a basis for spurring collective action and societal organization. Now, these forms of collective organization are limited in that they tend to take place around local communities. You might see people resist kind of the corruption of the state or fight things out in court, but those individuals tend to more so be individual actors rather than spurring kind of these societal organizations. Now, the organizations do act as a check on state power. So they limit the range of acceptable behavior on the part of the state. But their actual ability to influence decisions are still incredibly limited. This might open the door for increasing opportunities for collective and societal organization. And the organizations provide a limitation, a point that the state cannot go beyond. So even though there is this system of state predation where there's an incredible amount of corruption and elite theft of state assets, you have a certain point that even these officials cannot go beyond without inciting the organization of individuals within society. So there is still this element where the population still has the opportunity to voice their complaints and organize in order to prevent the state from continuing its patterns of theft. However, there has been an impact of the policies of Central Asian elites on how this region is both treated by the international community and how they treat the international community. So in the regional community, there have not been any serious talks of border changes and no targeting of ethnic minorities systematically by the state. So even when there is ethnic violence, the state is not usually an active partner or participant in this violence, even if it might covertly support activists on one side or the other. So the state has plausible deniability with any sort of ethnic violence, and there's also strict border controls within the region. So what this tells us is that the leaders of various Central Asian states are very wary of one another. Despite their historical connectiveness, there is a worry that there might be some sort of international conflict between these states, and many of these states would not be able to sustain a long-term conflict. So the leaders any singular state in Central Asia would not be likely to maintain power if there were to be some large-scale international conflict. So they would lose out on their revenue streams. So there are a lot of incentives for them to avoid any sort of regional conflict. And this has come in the form of the protection of ethnic minority groups, a hesitancy to mobilize along ethnic grounds, even though there are trans-border ethnic communities, and an increasing policy towards militarizing and locking down the borders between states so that militarized groups cannot find safe havens in other states within the region. This has cut down on the economic productivity of the region and has hampered its ability to engage in kind of these regional economic organizations that would help the region flourish more so on the global scale. But it also has prevented border conflicts within Central Asia. We also see these countries being very wary of Russian and Chinese influence. So Russia and China both border the region, and they're much more powerful than the Central Asian states. This can also act as a check on ethnic mobilizations. So any mobilization that might trigger, any mobilization that might target the ethnic Russian population, for instance, can't really occur without perhaps incurring Russia's wrath on that state or Russian influence. Ukraine has definitely increased worries of this kind of interference on behalf of ethnic Russians in Central Asia. And you also have China being another check, not so much in the presence of ethnic Chinese in Central Asia, but the large Turkic population in Western China that has co-ethnics in Central Asia. If some mobilization in Central Asia would also mobilize that community in China, you could see China choosing to cut off trade with Central Asia or investment. And these states are very reliant on Chinese money to keep certain projects going and to fund a lot of their state budgets. And if this were to be cut off, it would probably trigger an economic spiral. So they're very wary about mobilizing along ethnic lines within Central Asia due to economic concerns as well as military ones. So last week, our authors focused on kind of these clan identities or how ethnic leaders were framing conflicts. But here we see economic interest instead acting as a check on identity-based violence or exclusive nationalist identities in Central Asia. So those economic concerns on the part of the state are driving whether or not groups become mobilized along different identity lines. Also, in the post-Soviet era, we are seeing declining Western investment. So initially, we saw a lot of Western interest in these market reforms and privatization efforts where there was intense involvement and loans from Western financial institutions. But due to the risky investment environment in Central Asia and the lack of reform in the past 30 years, you've seen Western involvement decline over that time. And correspondingly, you've seen a rise in Russian and Chinese influence. And today, much of the aid that you see the Western community giving Central Asia, while it still carries some level of reform contingency, a lot of it is instead focused on military aid. But we've seen that drop off as well. So that spiked in the early 2000s. So increasingly, we're seeing less and less Western investment and intervention in Central Asia. And while this is the present trend, we might see that change depending on what happens in other sectors. But the West has typically viewed Central Asia as not a primary region of security concern, while Russia and China have. So it is likely that this kind of pattern of decreasing or at least inconsistent involvement in Central Asia continues. Alongside declining Western influence, you also have the rising influence of different alternatives to Western financial institutions. And these primarily come in the form of the Eurasian Economic Union and the Belt and Road Initiative. So the Eurasian Economic Union, alternatively called the EAEU or the EEU, was first proposed in 1994, but was actually established in 2015. So the long-standing negotiations to get it up off the ground. And initially, it was proposed to encompass all of the former Soviet states. So very similar to the Commonwealth of Independent States or the CSTO. Which is the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which was a replacement to the Security Organization of the former Soviet Union. You see the membership within the EAEU being fairly restricted vis-a-vis what was the Soviet Union. And you see a similar pattern with the Commonwealth of Independent States and the CSTO. And so the member states of the EAEU are Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Russia. So especially looking at Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Russia, all of these had some of the most integrated economies within the Soviet Union, and also have maintained some of the closest ties in the post-Soviet era. Armenia is also very reliant on Russian aid to fund its military effort against Azerbaijan. So historically, the Russian Federation has been supplying Armenia and kind of aiding their war effort. The Russian goal was to expand this to all of the post-Soviet states once again, but we have not seen them successful in doing so. And the idea is to turn this into a corollary to the European Union. So it's to unite the economies, legal systems, customs services of these states so that there is a common rule of law and common system of management so that they're able to trade freely with one another. The EAEU also contains explicit interest in uniting the military capabilities of these states. So between the EAEU and the CSTO, post-Soviet space has a corollary to the EU and to NATO. Although the effectiveness of these institutions is somewhat suspect. So the trade barriers between a lot of these states are still up. So it hasn't really accomplished a lot of its goals with regards to kind of reducing these barriers to trade, while they are lower than those that are not members of the EAEU. But membership is also fairly restricted. So while Armenia, for instance, is in the EAEU, Azerbaijan and Georgia are not, which means that Armenia lacks contiguous borders with the Russian Federation. And while Belarus is in the EAEU, Ukraine is not. And while Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan are members, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan are not. So there are members of these regional communities who are missing from being member states, and this kind of restricts the effectiveness of an institution like the EAEU. So even if you might have free movement of people and jobs between the states that are members, there are large swaths of territory that are not included within this that kind of cut off the various member states from one another. Additionally, member states have been hesitant to fully integrate with the Russian Federation. So in one instance, Ukraine was debating between having closer ties with the EU or the EAEU, and had been on the path to signing a provisional agreement with the European Union. But when this was coming to the fore under President Yanukovych, they very quickly switched gears in 2013 and stated that they were not going to be joining the EU, and instead we're going to have closer ties with the Russian Federation. And this was preceded by threats and actual gas cutoffs from Russia to Ukraine, and the the Putin administration had been threatening to erect trade barriers between Ukraine and Russia. And the primary export market for Ukrainian goods was Russia. And Ukraine is also incredibly reliant on Russian gas. So these served to force Ukraine to choose between the organization that it wanted to integrate with, so it wanted those closer ties with the European Union, and coerced Ukraine into rejecting the EU provisional agreement, which then triggered the Euromaidan protests in November, which eventually culminated in the Ukrainian civil war. And this does not go unnoticed by the other countries that are either member states of the EAEU or contemplating membership. And this has restricted the evolution of the EAEU and its expansion and effectiveness in post-Soviet space. On the other hand, we have China's Belt and Road Initiative, so the BRI. And the main goal of the BRI is to promote the economic development and interregional connectivity of the regions surrounding China. So one part of this is the Belt Initiative, and another is the road. So they're actually two different investment programs. One is focused on a land route over Central Asia for the purposes of trade, which focuses very heavily on infrastructure and energy developments. So building roads and power facilities across the Central Asian region. And another one focuses on a sea route into the Indian Ocean and then to the Arabian Peninsula and into Africa. This project was founded in 2013, and it is specifically a Chinese development strategy. And so it's much broader than the EAEU. Rather than trying to form some corollary to the EU, this is mostly focused on building up infrastructure and investing in different countries. So it has invested in infrastructure in over 70 countries, and it's engaged roughly 138 countries and 30 international organizations. So it has deals with a lot of countries to progress forward. And the main goal is to kind of recreate the traditional Chinese trade routes of the Silk Road, both overland and overseas. And of the Central Asian states, Kazakhstan has received the most investment, but all of the Central Asian states and Afghanistan have all received upwards of about $4 billion in aid. So most have received more than that. So around $8 to $10 billion on average. Kazakhstan has received much more than the surrounding states, which is not too terribly surprising considering its relative stability and the benefits that it can provide for this increased Chinese investment. And while these organizations are geared towards providing an alternative to Western financial institutions and Western aid, and in this, the Belt and Road Initiative, along with China's banking alternatives, serve as a potential competitor to kind of the existing aid framework. But this doesn't mean that they aren't exploitative as well. So the loan structuring that we see with Chinese aid and their tendency to rely on Chinese workers rather than workers who are from the countries that they're working in also means that these developments don't necessarily benefit the population that's in the country, and they also often claim rights to whatever they build. So if they build a deep water port, for instance, they might claim that they have rights to that deep water port more over the existing government, and they've done so in Pakistan, for instance, with the deep water port that they're constructing there. It's that port is Chinese; it just happens to be in Pakistan, and we see similar things happen in Central Asia. So the roads that they build, the power facilities that they build, are owned by Chinese companies or the Chinese government, and there is that potential that they may be seized on those grounds, or at the very least, the investors retain the ability to cut those off. So what we see between, Western financial institutions, the EAEU and the BRI, all of these serve the interests of the organization, country, what have you, who's running them. And even though they might bring marginal benefits to the country that they're meant to aid, you do see an incredible amount of corruption, regardless of which type of organization you turn to for investment in Central Asia. So it's just a facet of aid, is that it tends to come with strings, whether those strings are explicit like they are with Western aid, or if they're more covert like they are with the BRI. So in conclusion, we see several persistent themes with regards to the economic development of post-Soviet Central Asia. The first being the continuing legacy of the Soviet period. A lot of the institutions of the Soviet Union have survived in the economies of these countries, although how they are being used has been fundamentally altered by the collapse of the welfare state in Central Asia. Alongside this, we see increasing Russian and Chinese influence. We also see a lack of nationalist conflict. And last week, our readings talked about how that might be due to the various salient identities or framing, but this week, our readings cited the economic reasons for a lack of national conflict. There's also a high economic dependence on resource extraction in Central Asia that has prevented a lot of economic diversification and development into other non-extraction-based sectors. And you've also seen the aid and loans that these countries have received in the post-Soviet era favoring kind of these resource extraction countries. But overwhelmingly, there has been a lack of economic development. A lot of the early hopes for the post-Soviet era have not come to fruition. And lastly, despite the Central Asian states sharing many features in this post-Soviet era, so all of them have seen poor economic development. Most of them have high degrees of government corruption. We do see the countries in Central Asia taking a variety of approaches to deal with their economic weakness vis-a-vis Russia, China, the United States, and other international actors. And these techniques have seen a variety of success and failure in the post-Soviet era. And depending on the time, a potential strategy that they pursue may bring short-term benefits at long-term costs. And this is something that we'll discuss more for our Thursday lecture. But the reliance on short-term gains in these politics is something that becomes glaringly apparent, is that the political and economic instability in Central Asia leads to a lack of ability to predict and invest in long-term goals. And regardless of your level of economic development, this harms potential economic growth and investment in a country's economic future, or even its political future. And this has had a really devastating impact on not only Central Asia, but across post-Soviet space, where you've seen very repressed economic growth due to the lack of ability to anticipate long-term economic and political developments within the state. And this is despite the authoritarian nature of the regimes providing some level of certainty about who will be in power. the fickleness and ability of elites to pick winners and losers seemingly on an arbitrary basis means that economic actors, both domestic and international, lack the ability to invest with any sort of certainty, and that's really what markets rely on. So the political environment within these states interferes with the potential for economic growth. And that is where we'll leave it off for today. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this topic on Tuesday.